What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello and welcome back to Faith Undone, where we hope to re-navigate what it means to be human, to walk in a new kind of faith. So when the old system no longer works, how can we speak in a healthy way about this ancient book or a new world philosophy science? How do we talk about this now? So last week, we moved through what the good news actually meant for the first century people and how it had very little to do with an escape plan to a place in the sky or a crucifixion needed to satisfy an angry God. We kind of went through that. The idea that the good news was a message about a new way of being in the world. And it starts here and now. And so today we'll talk about the reach this new reality had. Because I believe that today you can actually call yourself a Christian and not really follow in the Christ path. I've heard a lot of well-meaning people say things like this. Look, the gospel, it's not religious, it's not political. We just need to focus on love. They'll say that often. It doesn't have any, we shouldn't get involved in politics and these arguments in our church systems. That's not what it's all about. And I have to be honest, while that seems kind of nice, it's actually a far cry from the message that this first century Jewish people had. It's a very different message than this Jewish rabbi shared. And so his message actually touches on politics and economics and religious systems. And I would argue it bravely flips the tables on how we view all three of these things. And so it has the potential to make things really uncomfortable, this new reality Jesus brings. So I want to start today by sharing this. There's a story about Jesus in all four of the books written about him. We call those the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he's heading toward Jerusalem, which was like, for the Jewish people, this would have been understood as the holy city, the place where God's presence was understood to be. It's especially present in the temple. And so it's where the religious actions of these people took place, where all their festivals would take place. And so the problem with Jerusalem and its religious structure was that it actually become really corrupted. And so the leaders, they started taking advantage of people, and they started using their power to economically prosper, and they used their own political agendas and everything in order to basically oppress others and put others in poverty. And so that was a pretty sick system. And I think probably we understand some of that, don't we? Abuses of power. We see some of this today. I would argue it's very obvious when we look at some of the religious structures today. I think of televangelists. Like a certain well-known televangelist gives this really inspiring message, and they ask for seed money, right, to be sent to their church. And if you do that, you'll be healed from anything from like an addiction to cancer. They're those kind of people. And unfortunately, our elderly and others, they're going to be duped into losing their savings and their retirement. And you'll see other people, we call these prosperity gospel preachers. They'll make claims that if you give enough money, God's going to bless you, right? He's going to give you everything you need, financial freedom. You'll have a pay raise and you'll finally get the home of your dreams. And yet, it's interesting because these same guys, they'll get online and they'll boast about how they've purchased these jets, all for God's glory, of course. And the reality is they're taking trips, holiday trips. It's just so sad to watch. It's what some of us might call really unjust. It's taking advantage of others. And it's benefiting at the expense of others in the name of religion in this case. And it's pretty gross. We've seen this happen in politics for sure. But it does happen in religious structures, and it was happening during Jesus' time. So during the first century, the temple, it had become this kind of abusive force in the world where, again, taking advantage of others. And so the message of the religious system, it was basically telling people that in order to experience peace with God and to be made whole, you had to sacrifice animals. And the leaders at this time, they were beginning to use this really archaic tradition to exploit and rip off people. And the priests and the money changers, they were the ones taking part in this. And so now get this. When people would bring their perfectly good sacrificial lamb or dove to the temple, they were often told that the animal was not acceptable. And so the priests, they would then charge them a much higher rate for a new animal. But behind the curtain, what they would do is they would actually recycle the unacceptable animal into the pens labeled acceptable sacrifices. So it's really pretty messed up. People at this time knew this was actually happening. But here's the problem. They were helpless because it was the priests. It was the priests doing this, the ones in power that were giving the inspection. The priests and the money changers were taking advantage of the people. They were using their religious power and their influence to exploit and oppress. And it happened then, and I would argue it happens today. And so the religious system had become so corrupted by power and money that it was no longer a place where healing actually happened. It actually, I would say it brought death. And so the writers of the Gospels, they tell their audience that when Jesus and his disciples, they're heading toward Jerusalem, they come upon this fig tree. And I remember reading about this thinking like, I don't get it. Like what's wrong with, why would Jesus gets angry so he like curses a fig tree? What's the deal with this story? But here's what happens in the story. Jesus and disciples, they come upon this fig tree and they see that the tree has leaves, but it has no fruit. It doesn't have any figs. And so, again, the story goes that Jesus, I guess, loses his cool, curses the tree, so it says to it, never bear fruit again, wither up. And most of us are kind of scratching our head. We're like, wait, what? Like, what is this? Jesus got mad at a tree. Now he's cursing it. Weird. And if this is the case where Jesus loses his cool, then I would say that this story doesn't have a lot of meaning. Gets mad at a tree, decides it shouldn't bear any fruit. It would sound odd to us. And it would be in our culture. But this story actually makes a lot of sense if you're part of that culture during that time period. And it's interesting too. I've had arguments with people. I should say discussions with people. They'll say, well, the Bible's easy to read. It was, if these first century fishermen could understand it, then we should be able to understand it without any interpreters or historical this or that. And I think, well, have you read Shakespeare lately? Because Shakespeare is a bit difficult for people to understand. And some of the language doesn't always make sense to us. And then you look at this book, the Bible, which is far older, 2,000-3,000 years past since we've had these pieces written. And yet you're going to say we don't need to actually look at the culture, the historical elements. I would argue, of course we do. Otherwise, you get some crazy interpretations that were far from what was actually taking place. Like the fig tree. Because for most of us, we didn't pick up what first century people would have been, hello, they would have said, yeah, that makes absolute sense. Because the fig tree is actually a symbol. It was a symbol for the Jewish people of their temple. And so the symbol was everywhere. So please understand, this story is actually really interesting. It's a revolutionary moment. Jesus is getting kind of political. He's poking at the system. He's saying some pretty serious things. Jesus curses the fig tree. So he essentially curses the temple, the place where the people felt God was, right? And Jesus says that place that is so important to you, that place where everything kind of moves through religiously and again, tied up in politics and economics, that place has no life left in it. So understand, that would be like someone today burning the American flag in front of the White House. This was a serious statement. It had political and religious and economic reaches. This was a serious statement. So as a first century reader, knowing Jesus is about to go to Jerusalem, where the temple is, the writers, they're basically setting the story up so you'll know Jesus is about to do something extraordinary, revolutionary. So yes, my friends who are posting these comments that Jesus was not a revolutionary and this and that, I'm afraid he was. He very much was. So the story goes that after he curses this fig tree, again, the temple, he's going to head into the literal temple. And so the story continues. When they arrive, Jesus, he just starts going postal. And it reads like this. He drove out the merchants and their customers. He flips over the tables and the money changers and the stalls of those selling doves, and stopped everyone from bringing loads of merchandise. So Jesus stops the economic flow of the people taking advantage of the poor, the marginalized, the powerless. And in other versions of the story, you have him whipping the cattle and other animals out of the temple as well. He flips the tables over, creates this huge chaotic mess. And while he does this, the writers write that Jesus quotes scripture. It's written in the scriptures, he says, "My temple is to be a place of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of robbers," right? So what's going on here is he's quoting scripture. The writers have Jesus quote scripture. Isaiah 56:7, Jeremiah 7:11. These are all references for when Israel starts abusing their power. So they essentially, in these moments, they lose focus and they start bringing more oppression instead of freedom. And so Jesus was actively protesting, passionately disagreeing without causing violence. He didn't cause violence. The whip he's using he's not hitting people with it. He's using it to drive out animals. So this is not a violent act. This is actually a peaceful protest. And we call this resistance, right? He makes a huge political, economic, religious statement here. And when he does that, Jesus exposes the evils of this system. And so the buyers and the sellers, as well as these temple priests, they're watching as their money runs out of the temple, and they're losing their profits. And so what do? These highly respected men, they chase after their profit. They chase after their livestock. They run, which in that culture would have been something that you did not do if you were a well-respected person. So what's happening is they actually lose their dignity. They look really bad. They were exposed. The story goes that they ran. And so Jesus isn't losing his cool, by the way. He wasn't going postal. He was protesting against the corruption of a religious system controlled by greed and hypocrisy. And so Jesus teaches us here that we can disagree with the political, religious, economic system without ever having to reach for a sword. That was the point of what he's sharing there. We can non-violently protest with passion against powers that oppress. We can do this. And again, we can do this in a new kind of way. And this is the beauty of the Christ message. The new reality, the new way of being in this world, it has no room for oppression, abuse of power, inequality, injustice, corruption. It has no place for that. The new reality Jesus teaches about is one in which the systems that control using power and fear, they're exposed in the light of the new reality. Because when this new kingdom comes, it completely exposes all other kingdoms for what they are. So this new reality is one in which love, forgiveness, mercy are weapons that actually overcome systems of abuse. We actually use them to fight against abuse. And so there's a lot of us right now who are unhappy with the various systems we're involved in. And I see these abuses politically. Right now, we are in such a mess politically in our nation. It's very easy to get frustrated. It's very easy to write those posts online, to get into these huge arguments. Economically, it's so difficult for so many of us. Some of us are taking on extra jobs. We're just struggling, and it doesn't seem like things are going to get much better. And some of us right now, we are in religious structures that are just frustrating us. We're waiting for things to change. We're trying to cause change, and yet we see all of these really good, intelligent people leaving out the back door. And we're wondering, are we all alone? We're wondering, is this thing ever going to change? Does everyone have to die off before this positive change can happen? So what do? Do we go flip tables? What do? I'm learning there's a couple things right now that I can do. One of them is this. I'm learning to avoid the social media threads. because I can waste so much time on those stinking things. There's so many times in conversations where we're actually like tempted to respond online with hateful remarks, right? Smearing other people's reputations. We use these just garbage words back and forth, and we actually waste so much energy doing it when there's actually no positive thing that comes from it. And so we'll go back and forth when we see these insane posts. We just have to respond, right? But if we're going to be honest, every time we chose to swim in that pool, every time we chose to engage in that thread, we found ourselves more frustrated and more angry. And so I'm learning to just stop, remind myself that the issue, the problem is the problem. It's not the person. And when you're at odds with someone or a system or whatever it is, remember it's the problem. It's the act against freedom and life that you found yourself at odds with, not necessarily the person. Stop demonizing the person. The idea might be just evil. The actions are evil, but maybe step away from it so we don't assume the person is too. You can work with a person because people are redeemable. The idea is the thing that needs to be shifted. And the only way to shift ideas truly is to do it with respect, conversation, love. That's the only way you're going to shift conversation. And it usually doesn't happen on a social media thread. It just doesn't. So maybe stop wasting your time being the whistleblower on the media thread, because you're probably not going to get the results you're hoping for. Another thing I'm learning is use redemptive language. I'm slowly learning this. I'm learning that it's actually really destructive when I start name calling and using the kind of language that others might be using. I don't have to demonize someone in order to make a difference. If my language gets ugly, then I'm actually doing the exact same thing the other side's doing. So just as violence escalates more violence, mudslinging, demonizing others, it only brings more pain, more brokenness, more division. It actually stops conversation altogether. So again, when you speak to people, or if you're gonna post, if you have to post, if your finger's just like, I gotta post, then try using redemptive language. Try building bridges in your writing or your conversation. And the last piece of advice that I'm learning is engage in the process. If you're going to have an opinion, make sure you've done the research. Make sure you understand the issues at hand. Become more knowledgeable about the political system, your state, your country. Because if we're going to create change, we have to know what truly needs changing, right? And we need to know, we need to be a part of the process in order to change the process. And I would argue the same thing with churches. If you're going to create change, you have to be involved in it. And I know it's very easy to leave, and sometimes you have to leave. Sometimes it just gets so bad, yeah, you have to leave. But other times, there are ways in which we can create change. And so there are all these different arguments right now going on. There are all these different discussions about anything from women's rights, homosexuality. It's all out there. And I would argue we need to be even more prepared, more than ever, with good answers. If they're going to use scripture, then delve into the scripture. Find out what those words actually mean. Because when you do, you've just taken on a lot of power. And what you do with that power is what's important. So engage in the process and do it lovingly. Jesus' kingdom message, it turned everything upside down. And I believe it still has the power to continue to do so today. And I believe this kingdom, it can become a reality, but it takes those who are willing to say this thing, this system, this brokenness, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't have a place. And it takes brave people willing to stand up, flip the tables in a Jesus-like manner, to peacefully protest, to change systems from within. And so I believe one can be a follower of Christ even today, without all of the baggage and all of the abuses. You can walk the Christ path. And so my prayer for you this week is that when you see injustice, you might ask the question, what does the kingdom of heaven look like? How can I be a part of repair? What can I do to flip the tables and bring new life again? Because that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus' message it touched on politics, economics, religion. And I would argue we as human beings, as members of this global society, we are called to be involved in those same things, to bring change. And my prayer for us is that we do it in redemptive, peaceful ways. I hope you have a great week, and I can't wait to talk to you next week as we continue to move through the different teachings of Jesus and what they truly meant within the culture he was in. Also, keep in mind, in a couple weeks, I'm going to delve into the concept of homosexuality. And I'm going to share with you what these words actually meant in Scripture and how they've been changed and morphed into some meanings that may not have been intended. And I hope that it kind of shifts the way that you view the whole discussion in a redemptive way. So blessings this week, and I can't wait to talk to you next week. As always, please go to tonywerfel.com. Take a look at the blog, the podcasts. If you have any questions, send me those questions. And as always, the Patreon page is there if you'd like to help support. Blessings. Talk to you next week. Bye.